Hi everyone and welcome to the channel. Setting up your steering properly is one of the most important things you can do to your RC car, but because it combines mechanical and electronic adjustments, it can be surprisingly complicated. Do it right and you'll have much better control and adjustability. Do it wrong and you can end up breaking things. Here we have 3 different cars and 2 different handsets. In this video I'll be running through 7 steps you need to take to get that steering spot on. First of all, a quick overview of the cars and radios. Here we have an Associated B7 buggy, and next to it we have a Tamiya M08 Mini. Both of these are paired to a Futaba 4PM transmitter. Next to them we have an Element Enduro crawler. This one is paired to a Futaba 3PV. Realistically, you're going to need a mid-range or better radio to do these settings correctly, as cheap radios don't generally include them all, but you might still be able to pick up some tips. I'll be using Futaba's names for these settings because I've always used Futaba radios. Other brands have similar settings but don't necessarily give them the same names. My B7 will be my main focus, but I'll also look at the other 2 cars to show some of the differences in setup. Now let's work step by step through the adjustments you need to make. Step 1 is to do your mechanical checks. It goes without saying that the car should be built correctly before you even try to set things up. If you've bodged it together with damaged parts, you're not going to get anywhere. And it's surprisingly easy to build cars wrong. A lot of people attach the steering rack backwards on the B7 by mistake. Here on the Tamiya M08 you have grub screws to limit steering lock that need to be identical on each side. There's a couple of key things to check after that. Start off by disconnecting the servo. In this case I've removed it entirely. Make sure the car is set up correctly for ride height, camber and tow beforehand. Every time you adjust the suspension geometry, it's going to have an impact on the steering. Make sure the steering links are the same length on each side so that the mechanism is centered and has equal movement in both directions. Move the steering mechanism by hand from lock to lock at full compression and at full extension to make sure that nothing is binding. RC cars are extremely sensitive to binding in the steering, so if you find a tight spot, work out what's causing it and adjust the car to suit. This car is nice and smooth, but with some buggies you can have problems if the front shock travel is too long. On the Element Enduro, the ball joints are right at the limit of their movement when the suspension is fully extended. Step 2 is the first setting on the radio, and it's a pretty simple one, but one that you'll really regret overlooking. But before making any changes to the radio, a warning. Make sure everything on the steering is set to its defaults. Ideally, start from a fresh model memory. One hidden change deep in the menu can really mess things up. Back to that setting. It's servo reverse. You should be able to visualize which direction the servo needs to go in to move the steering in the correct direction. If you can't, just attach the linkage again quickly. In the case of the B7, I want it set so that turning the wheel to the right moves the servo to the left from this perspective, which then moves the steering to the right. But because reversing the servo will also swap around all your other servo settings, if you get it wrong now, you'll have to start all over again. Reverse won't be the same for every servo and for every car. For what it's worth, my B7 has the servo set to normal. Step 3 is a really important setting on the transmitter, and one that's often misunderstood. It's called sub-trim. I'll try and explain it using a diagram. Let's say that this line represents the full travel of the servo, left, right and centre, with 100 steps in each direction. If we add 10 steps of normal trim to the right, like you might be tempted to do to align the servo horn in the car, you'll end up with 90 steps of travel remaining on the right and 110 remaining on the left. This isn't very helpful when we're trying to get even travel on both sides. Sub-trim is different. With sub-trim, if we move it 10 steps to the right, the whole range of servo travel also moves 10 steps to the right. So we still have 100 steps of travel on either side. Perfect for getting the right initial setup. There's another thing you need to consider when setting sub-trim, and that's the angle of the servo horn. Normally the manual will make the position of the horn fairly clear, but if it doesn't, remember that right angles are your friend. Usually the neutral position for the servo horn will be at either 90 degrees to the servo or at 90 degrees to the servo linkage. Sometimes you might need to experiment to work out which one gives the correct amount of travel without binding against other parts. For the B7, the horn should be at 90 degrees to the servo. The M08 is an interesting example. There are parts going off at all sorts of angles which might make you think it's a special case. In fact, it all boils down to right angles again. Look at the pivot points of the servo saver and the bell cranks, and you'll see a right angle here and a right angle here. Meanwhile, the crawler runs the servo horn in line with the servo case. Once you have the correct setting on the subtrim, you should adjust the length of the servo linkage so that the steering mechanism is centred. On the B7 you don't have a turnbuckle here, so you can't do a fine adjustment, and you might need an extra tweak on the subtrim. As you can see, it's currently set to 80, and moving it 10 in either direction will also change the position of the steering rack. Step 4 is endpoint adjustment, or EPA. This is another one that's often misunderstood. The aim is to set the EPA so you get full steering lock in each direction, no more and no less. It's not used to limit steering lock. That's the job of the dual rate setting, which I'll cover later. Make sure that the dual rate is set to 100 while you're working with the EPA. This is currently set to 95, but you'll see that if I reduce that by 10, the amount of steering lock decreases. However, if I was to increase the amount of EPA to 105, there wouldn't be any extra steering lock. And in fact, on some radios and servos, you'll hear buzzing as the servo is straining against the suspension, and sometimes parts will start to bend. That isn't good news. On a Futaba, you usually have the option to increase the EPA to 120%, so there should be no excuse for not getting full lock. The bench setup is now complete. The next few steps are about using the right settings when you run the car. Step 5 is trim. Even the most basic radios include this, but it's still something that a lot of people don't take the time to adjust. Trim is there to make sure that the car runs in a straight line when you aren't steering. Even a couple of clicks of trim can make a huge difference to the driving experience. When you're racing, the difference between a car that needs no corrections as it goes down the straight and one that is gradually veering towards the track markings is enormous. As soon as you put the car down, do a straight line test and adjust your trim to make sure the car really is going where you want it to. This car is currently set to 0 units of trim. If the car needs more than about 10 units of trim to run in a straight line, there's probably something off with the build, so give it a good going over. There is a deep rabbit hole that you can go down if you're trying to fix a car that doesn't run straight, and I don't want to cover that in this video. On the Futaba 4PM, you can see there's a small section of the display that shows how much trim you've added to the car. An exception to that is the crawler, because the drivetrain causes loads of torque steer, and I can guarantee you'll have to add a lot of trim to make it run straight at full throttle. Don't worry about it. Step 6 is exponential. This is the curve of the response of the servo. Negative expo means that the servo will turn relatively less at small inputs, and positive expo will make the servo turn more at small inputs. Generally, I set this so that the smallest inputs I'm able to make with my hands still keep the car under control. If the car reacts too much when I make small corrections on the straight, I reduce the expo. I'll often end up reducing the expo as low as -50% to get a good balance between smoothness of response and linearity. The 4PM actually shows a handy graph when you make the adjustment. It's not something I worry about when I'm using a crawler. Step 7 is dual rate. This may well be the most powerful setting available to you in the middle of a race, because it can completely change the handling of your car. If your car is oversteering, reducing the dual rate will fix that. If it starts understeering, increasing the dual rate will give you that steering back again. It's no substitute for a good setup, but as a quick fix, it's hard to beat. Personally, I tend to start the car at 100% dual rate and reduce if necessary. Others may prefer to start with a lower dual rate and adjust either up or down depending on the conditions. Just make sure that you still have enough steering lock to turn a full circle in the narrowest part of the track, otherwise you may not be able to steer yourself out of trouble. Dual rate is usually assigned to a button on the controller, so you can change it without having to go into the menu. On the 4PM it's at the top of the grip, and on a 3PV it's to the side of the wheel. The B7 is currently set to 90% dual rate, the M08 and the crawler are both at 100%. And that's the end of my 7 steps to the perfect steering setup. Hopefully you found it useful. But before I finish, there's one more setting that I want to mention, a setting that a lot of people talk about and that a lot of people use and that I personally do not recommend. That setting is steering speed. Many modern servos are extremely fast, and there is an idea floating around that if the servo is too fast, it will load up the tyre too fast, causing a loss of grip. There may be a grain of truth in that, but here's the thing. If you're steering so quickly with your hand that you're hitting full lock within 1/10 of a second, I guarantee that you are not driving smoothly in the first place. Artificially slowing down the servo may feel easier to drive at first, but it won't be long before it starts slowing you down by failing to respond when you need it to. Practice smooth steering inputs and you won't need to slow down the servo. A lot of the perceived speed of the servo comes from the endpoint settings and the expo anyway, and if you followed the steps in this video, you'll already be at a good starting point and won't need to mess about with extra settings on the radio. Okay, rant over, and time to bring this to a close. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them below and I'll try to respond. If you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out. As ever, thank you very much for watching.